Today we're going to cover authorized, issued, common, preferred shares. Shares in a corporation, that's all different types of shares that you can have in a corporation. And so you can see it's confusing. I get this question all the time, and I'm going to explain to you sort of how shares are structured in corporations and hopefully dispel some of the confusion on all of how they work. So let's start with authorized versus issued shares. Now, when you open up a corporation, when you file paperwork with the state to form your corporation, you have to authorize a certain number of shares. The number is totally up to you. It's kind of arbitrary, to be honest. And usually the best practice is to authorize like 10 million, as many shares as you can, because then you have that many shares available and authorized. That's almost the same when we're talking about this terminology. You have 10 million available shares to issue to shareholders. Those are the people that become owners once they own shares. So when you authorize 10 million shares, there's still actually no issued shares, which means there's technically still no ownership. Because when you issue shares, that's when they become official ownership in the corporation. So what that means is, let's authorize 10 million shares. We'll use some easy numbers right now. If you issue 100 shares to yourself, you are the 100% owner of that corporation, even though there's still 9,909,000, or I'm not a math whiz here, I'm a lawyer. Whatever's left, those are authorized and available. The issued shares are all that matter for ownership. So to make this example make a little bit more sense with dilution, which you hear about with corporations, you now have 100 shares. Let's say you now issue another 100 shares to someone else. Well, you both have 100 shares. There's a total of 200 shares issued, and that 200 shares is the 100% ownership in that corporation. You each have 50%. So you can see the more shares you issue, the more it dilutes existing shareholders, existing owners' percentage in the company. But that authorized pool of shares, the now 9,900,800,000, isn't ownership. It's just authorized and available. So when you hear about like stock option pools and available pools for employees, that would come out of the authorized shares and be issued to those employees when they exercise that option. And I cover stock options in another video, too much for right now. But getting back to authorized and issued, you can have authorized shares that don't count. Once they're issued, they do count, and they expand how many shares have been issued, but it's always going to be 100%, so that's how you get diluted on your percentage as you issue more shares. Now, the overall shares are going to be made up of common shares, common stock, preferred shares, and preferred stock. Now, the reason to have two different types of classes of stock is to associate different voting rights, different responsibilities, just basically have different kind of classes of ownership within the corporation. The best reason to do this is when you have outside investors, people that write a check, they invest some money, they don't want to be involved, they just want money back when it does well because they gave you some money and they got X percentage of ownership, so they get X percentage of profits. Now, I would usually recommend that they get preferred shares with non-voting rights. So they have shares, they get that profit, whatever percentage they have, based on whatever terms you agree, they get it quarterly or annually or whatever the case may be, but they don't get to vote. So that you, as a common stock owner that retains voting rights, you get to make all the decisions to run the company. And I talk a lot about the decision making and how that works in a corporation in my corporate video. Watch that for more details on that. But you can separate preferred and common stock, different voting rights, different ownership responsibilities. And that's the types of classes of stock that make up your overall either authorized or issued stock. And typically, it's not going to be common or preferred until it is issued, because you authorize just a huge pool of shares and then you issue them and give them the rights and responsibilities. So, the question all the time, stocks and shares, are they the same, and how do they work, and why is there preferred and common, and what they're not, they don't count if they're authorized and just available. Hopefully this helped this make all sense a little bit better, because it is confusing, but once you break it down and once you're in there and you're talking about giving ownership to an investor and you don't want them to have voting rights, it makes a lot of sense how that works. And when you give someone more shares and you're getting diluted, it makes sense in practice. So hopefully this gives you a good foundation for once you start having those conversations and having to make some ownership decisions, that you understand it a little bit better and can maybe talk to your lawyer a little bit better about it. Thanks for tuning in. Check out my other videos for more in-depth details on some of these topics.